to understand how computer works, you don't need to know every single part of the motherboard. However, it is good to know some of the more important parts. Here are some of the typical parts. Motherboard. A motherboard is the most essential part of a computer system. It holds together many crucial components like CPU or Central Processing Unit, the memory, and the input and output devices, or what we call the connectors for integrated peripherals. First, a CPU socket. The actual CPU is directly soldered onto the socket. Since high-speed CPUs generate a lot of heat, there are heat sinks and mounting points for fans right next to the CPU socket. Second, a power connector. A power connector is to distribute power to the CPU and the other components. Next is chip. A chip forms an interface between the CPU, the main memory, and the other components. On many types of motherboards, this is referred to as the North Bridge. This chip also contains a large heatsink. Next to this is a second chip. Second chip controls the input and output functions. It is not connected directly to the CPU, but to the North Bridge. Slots. Slots for one or more hard drives to store files. The most types of the connections are integrated drives electronics, or the IDE. Next, a slot for a video or graphics card. There are a number of different types of slot, including the accelerated graphics port or the AGP. And lastly, additional slots to connect hardware in the form of peripheral component interconnect or PCI slots.
The chipset basically consists of two chips. One is called the North Bridge and the other is called the South Bridge. The North Bridge is located in the upper or northern part of the motherboard, providing you're looking at the motherboard in the upright position. It's located near the CPU and is directly connected to the CPU. It's also directly connected to the memory and the AGP and PCI Express slots. So in order for the CPU to communicate with the memory and the AGP or PCI Express bus, it has to go through the North Bridge first. So the North Bridge acts like a communication middleman between the CPU, AGP or PCI Express, and memory. The other chip is called the South Bridge. And the South Bridge is located at the bottom or southern portion of the motherboard, near the PCI bus slots. The South Bridge connects to the PCI bus slots, SATA and IDE connectors, and USB ports. So the South Bridge is responsible for the lower portion of the motherboard, while the North Bridge is responsible for the upper portion. There is no direct connection between the CPU and the lower portion of the motherboard. So if the PCI, USB, IDE, or SATA ports needed to communicate with the CPU, the information has to go through the South Bridge, and then up through the North Bridge, and then to the CPU. The North Bridge is faster than the South Bridge, and that's because the CPU, the PCIe, AGP, and memory are the most used and most important components of the motherboard, so they need to operate at the highest speeds possible. The slower south bridge communicates with the PCI bus, SATA and IDE connectors, and USB ports, and they don't need to be as fast as the other components. So basically the higher speed components are connected to the north bridge, and the slower components are connected to the south bridge.
So let's start with the power connector. A power connector is used to distribute power to the CPU and to the rest components of the motherboard. Next is the CPU socket. CPU socket. The actual CPU is direct soldered into the socket. Since high-speed CPU generate a lot of heat, there are heat sinks and mounting points or fans right next to the CPU socket. So next is slots for system's memory, or we call DRAM slots.
Released in 1981, the original IBM personal computer featured the first motherboard.